Somewhere right now, someone is lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying a sentence they said 4 hours ago. They're wondering if it came out wrong. They're wondering if the silence after it meant something. They're already rehearsing the apology they'll give tomorrow for something the other person probably forgot within 30 seconds. Somewhere else, someone is sitting in front of two open tabs, trying to decide which health insurance plan to pick. And 45 minutes later, they're still on the same two tabs, no closer to a decision, except now they also feel like a failure for taking so long. And somewhere else, someone is about to send a 2-line text message. They've rewritten it 6 times. They've read it out loud. They've imagined 7 different ways it could be misread. They have not sent it yet. These people are not lazy. They are not indecisive by nature. Many of them are sharp, perceptive, and deeply responsible. And yet their minds will not stop turning something over long after the useful thinking is finished and something else has taken its place. This video is about that something else. It's about the psychology of people who think too much, where it comes from, what it's actually doing to the brain and the body, why it so often shows up in people who are unusually intelligent or empathetic, and, eventually, what actually helps. Not slogans, not just stop worrying. Real mechanisms and real tools. Almost everyone has at some point called themselves, or heard someone else called, an overthinker. It's become such a common piece of self-description that it risks sounding like a personality quiz result, something breezy and half-joking, like being a perfectionist or a night owl. But underneath the casual label is something that clinical psychologists take very seriously because chronic overthinking is not a personality quirk sitting off to the side of a person's life. It is often the engine room of anxiety disorders, depressive episodes, insomnia, chronic stress, and a whole category of decision paralysis that can quietly shape and shrink a person's life for years. Here's the strange part. Overthinking doesn't look like a malfunction from the inside. It feels like responsibility. It feels like care. It feels like the opposite of carelessness. I'm just being thorough. I just want to get this right. I just want to understand what happened. The overthinking mind rarely announces itself as a problem. It announces itself as diligence. That's part of why it's so hard to catch and so hard to stop. You can't tell the difference, in the moment, between the thinking that is actually solving something and the thinking that is just spinning, because both feel like thinking. Both feel productive. Both feel important. So over the course of this video, we're going to pull that apart. We're going to look at what overthinking actually is, psychologically and neurologically, and how it's different from problem solving. 2 specific, well-studied patterns called rumination and worry, and how they hijack the mind in different directions, one toward the past, one toward the future. Where this pattern tends to come from: childhood environment, attachment style, temperament, and trauma, the specific personality profile that tends to overthink most, the traits, the trade-offs, and the paradox of intelligence and anxiety, what overthinking actually costs a person in relationships, career, physical health, and identity, what overthinking sometimes gives a person. Because this pattern isn't purely a defect, it has an evolutionary logic, and in the right amount, it produces real advantages. And finally, a full toolkit, evidence-based, practical, and specific, for interrupting the cycle without pretending it doesn't exist. One thing before we start. If you recognize yourself heavily in the next 30 minutes, that's common, and it doesn't mean something is broken in you. It usually means your mind is trying, clumsily, exhaustingly, to protect you from something. Understanding the mechanism is the first step toward loosening its grip. So let's understand it. Problem solving is thinking that is directed at a specific, definable question that moves toward a decision or an action, and that stops once it has enough information to proceed. If you're deciding which apartment to rent, and you spend an evening comparing rent, commute time, and neighborhood safety, and by the end of the evening, you've picked one. That's problem solving. It had a shape. It had an ending. Overthinking is thinking that either has no clear question at its center, or has a question that thinking cannot actually answer. Does he secretly think less of me? What if I made the wrong choice and I never find out? Why did I say that? And it does not stop when it runs out of new information. It just loops, the same handful of thoughts, recombined and replayed without arriving anywhere. Psychologists generally split this looping pattern into 2 related but distinct processes. The first is rumination, thinking that is oriented toward the past. Rumination replays events that have already happened. Conversations, mistakes, embarrassments, losses. It asks why questions that don't have clean answers. Why did this happen? Why did I do that? Why do I always do this? Rumination is strongly linked to depression. In fact, One of the most well-replicated findings in clinical psychology is that people who ruminate after a low mood tend to stay depressed longer and recover more slowly than people who distract themselves or engage in active problem-solving instead. The second is worry. Thinking that is oriented toward the future. Worry runs simulations of things that haven't happened yet, usually bad ones. What if I get laid off? What if this pain is something serious? What if they're upset with me and just haven't said so? Worry is the central feature of generalized anxiety disorder, and unlike rumination, it often feels useful because it's dressed up as preparation. The mind tells itself, if I imagine every bad outcome now, I'll be ready for it, or I'll prevent it. This is almost never actually true, but it is an extremely convincing story, which is exactly why worry is so hard to switch off. Here's the key insight that ties both of these together. Overthinking is not a thinking problem. It's a stopping problem. The overthinking mind is not bad at generating thoughts. If anything, it's very good at it. What it lacks is a reliable mechanism for recognizing when a thought has stopped being useful and closing the loop. A person without this pattern thinks about a problem, reaches a good enough conclusion, and moves on. A person with this pattern keeps searching for a conclusion that feels completely certain, completely safe, completely resolved, and because certainty like that is often not available, the search never really ends. This is why simply thinking about it more almost never helps an overthinker. More thinking is exactly the substance they already have too much of. What's actually missing isn't more analysis. It's an off switch. To understand why the off switch is missing, it helps to look at what's actually happening in the brain during overthinking. Not as a party trick of neuroscience trivia, but because it explains something important. Overthinking is not a character flaw. It's a specific, identifiable brain state, and it behaves according to its own rules. When the brain isn't focused on an external task, when you're not actively solving a problem, having a conversation, or doing something that demands your attention, it doesn't go quiet. A specific network of brain regions called the default mode network becomes more active. This network is involved in self-referential thought, thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your relationships, your identity. It's the machinery behind daydreaming, autobiographical memory, and imagining hypothetical scenarios. In moderate amounts, the default mode network is enormously useful. It's how we plan, how we make sense of our own experiences, how we imagine other people's perspectives, how we construct meaning out of a day's events. Without it, we'd be unable to reflect on anything. But in people who overthink, this network tends to be more active, more easily triggered, and, critically, harder to switch off in favor of task-focused attention. Neuroimaging studies on rumination and anxiety consistently find heightened connectivity within default mode circuitry, particularly in a hub called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is heavily involved in self-focused evaluation. How am I doing? What do people think of me? Did I do that right? The overthinking brain, in other words, doesn't just reflect. It's stuck slightly closer to reflect than act, even when action is what's called for. Layered on top of this is the brain's threat detection center, the amygdala. The amygdala's job is to scan for danger and trigger the body's stress response before conscious thought even catches up. In people prone to anxiety and worry, the amygdala tends to be more reactive, quicker to fire and slower to settle back down, particularly in response to ambiguous or uncertain situations. This matters because so much of what overthinkers ruminate and worry about is ambiguous. An unclear tone in a text message, a look on someone's face, an outcome that hasn't happened yet, and therefore can't be checked. Ambiguity is the amygdala's least favorite thing because it can't be resolved through fight or flight. It can only be resolved, the brain assumes, through more analysis. So the amygdala keeps sending "this is not settled" signals, and the prefrontal cortex keeps trying to settle it by thinking harder, and the loop feeds itself.
The part of the brain that's supposed to interrupt this, the prefrontal cortex regulatory circuitry, especially regions involved in cognitive control, normally acts like a brake pedal. It notices when a thought pattern has become unproductive and redirects attention elsewhere. In chronic overthinkers, particularly under stress, this braking function is often measurably weaker. It's not that the person lacks intelligence or willpower. Cognitive control is a finite, fatigable resource, and chronic stress hormones like cortisol actively impair the very brain regions responsible for exercising it. This creates a cruel feedback loop. The more a person overthinks, the more stressed they become. The more stressed they become, the worse their brain gets at stopping the overthinking. Finally, there's a chemical dimension. Elevated cortisol from prolonged stress interferes with sleep, and poor sleep, in turn, is one of the single strongest predictors of increased next-day rumination and worry, creating another loop, this time between the mind and the body. Meanwhile, Some research on serotonin and dopamine regulation suggests that the brain's mood stabilizing chemistry is itself altered by chronic rumination, which is part of why rumination is so tightly linked to the onset and persistence of depressive episodes. Put all of this together and a picture emerges. Overthinking isn't excessive intelligence and it isn't weakness. It's a specific pattern of an overactive self-referential network, a trigger-happy threat detector, and an under-resourced braking system. A set of dials that, in most people, sit closer to balance and in overthinkers are turned up. That's important because it reframes the goal. You cannot argue your way out of a neurological loop using more arguments. That's just feeding the same circuit. What actually works, as we'll get to later, involves interrupting the loop at the level of attention and physiology, not at the level of logic. If overthinking were purely genetic wiring, it would show up randomly across the population. It doesn't. It clusters heavily around certain kinds of early environments. Temperament sets the stage, but experience tends to write the script. Picture a child growing up in a household where a parent's mood was unpredictable, not necessarily abusive, just inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes irritable, sometimes distracted, and the child could never quite predict which version they'd get when they walked through the door. A child in that environment develops something psychologists call hypervigilance, a constant, low-level scanning of other people's faces, tones, and body language, trying to detect danger signals before they fully arrive. This is, in a very real sense, adaptive. A child who can read the room accurately gets fewer nasty surprises. But the skill doesn't turn off when the child grows up and leaves that environment. The nervous system that learned always be scanning for what might go wrong doesn't know the danger has passed just because the address changed. It keeps scanning at work, in friendships, in romantic relationships, and scanning applied to situations that no longer contain real threat is what we experience as overthinking. Attachment theory offers one of the clearest frameworks here. Children build an internal model of relationships based on how consistently their early caregivers met their needs. Kids who received warm, consistent, responsive care tend to develop what's called secure attachment, a baseline trust that others are generally safe and that they themselves are worthy of care. Kids whose care was inconsistent, sometimes attentive, sometimes not, for reasons the child couldn't predict or control, often develop anxious attachment. An anxious attachment in adulthood is one of the strongest known predictors of relational overthinking. Replaying conversations for signs of rejection, overanalyzing a delayed text reply, assuming silence means anger. The mind isn't being irrational by its own internal logic, it's applying a rule that once kept a child safe. Stay alert, because affection here can disappear without warning. Other children, faced with caregivers who were consistently unavailable or dismissive of their emotional needs, develop avoidant attachment. And here, overthinking often shows up differently, as intense private rumination that never gets voiced, because the child learned early that expressing need doesn't get met. So better to work it out alone, silently, exhaustively. A related and very common pattern shows up in children who were, in one way or another, given responsibilities beyond their developmental stage. The oldest child managing younger siblings during a parent's illness, the child of a parent with an addiction who learned to monitor that parent's mood to keep the household stable, the child praised primarily for being so mature or so easy. These children learn that vigilance is their value. Thinking ahead, anticipating problems, managing other people's emotional states, this becomes their role in the family system and often their sense of worth. It is not a large step from, I keep everyone safe by anticipating problems in childhood to, I must think through every possible outcome in adulthood. Finally, there's a pattern seen in children raised in environments where love or approval seem to depend on performance. Good grades, good behavior, being impressive. These children often internalize a belief that mistakes are dangerous, not just inconvenient, that an error might cost them belonging, not just a grade. That belief, carried into adulthood, produces a very specific flavor of overthinking, obsessive pre-checking before a decision, and obsessive post-mortem after one, both driven by the same underlying fear. What if this mistake reveals that I'm not good enough to be loved? None of this means overthinking is simply your parents' fault. Genetics, temperament, culture, and specific life events all play a role too. And two children in the same household can come out with very different relationships to their own thoughts. But understanding the origin matters for one practical reason. It reframes overthinking from a flaw I have to a strategy I learn. And strategies, unlike flaws, can be updated once they're no longer needed. Not everyone overthinks equally, and the people who do tend to share a recognizable cluster of traits. Using the well established 5-factor model of personality: openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, a fairly consistent profile emerges from the research on rumination and worry. This is the strongest and most obvious link. Neuroticism, in psychological terms, isn't being neurotic in the everyday insulting sense. It refers to a person's tendency to experience negative emotions more intensely and more frequently, and to have a lower threshold for what counts as a stressor. People high in this trait don't just feel more anxiety in objectively difficult moments. They feel meaningful anxiety in ambiguous moments that other people would barely register. That ambiguity, as we covered earlier, is exactly the fuel overthinking runs on. This one surprises people. Openness is associated with imagination, curiosity, and a rich inner mental life. And while it's generally considered a positive trait linked to creativity, it also means a more active, more elaborate default mode network. A highly open mind doesn't just register, "I made a mistake at work today." It spins that mistake into 5 different narrative interpretations, imagines how a colleague perceived it, imagines 3 ways it might play out next week, and constructs a small internal story around it. The same imaginative machinery that produces art, insight, and empathy also produces incredibly detailed, anxious spirals when pointed at a worry instead of a canvas. Conscientious people are organized, responsible, and thoroughness, past a certain point, curdles into something else. There's a specific subtrait sometimes called self-critical perfectionism, where a person's standards for their own performance are not just high, but essentially unmeetable, and the sense of self-worth is tightly tied to meeting them. This is different from healthy ambition. Healthy ambition says, "I want to do this well." Self-critical perfectionism says, "If I don't do this perfectly, something is wrong with me." And that belief keeps the analysis running long after the practical usefulness of the analysis has ended. People who are highly attuned to others' emotional states, a trait closely tied to agreeableness and to what psychologists call high trait empathy, are especially prone to a specific subtype of overthinking, replaying social interactions to check whether they hurt or upset someone, overinterpreting tone and body language, and carrying other people's moods as though they were partly. You'll find plenty of content online mapping overthinking onto specific personality type systems, certain Myers-Briggs types, certain Enneagram numbers, with confident claims about exactly which type overthinks the most. It's worth being honest here. Those typing systems are popular and can be a fun way to reflect on yourself, but they don't have strong scientific backing, and the trait research above, from the well-validated 5-factor model, tells a more reliable and more useful story. The pattern isn't about which 4-letter type you are. It's about where you sit on well-measured dimensions like neuroticism, openness, and self-critical perfectionism. And most chronic overthinkers sit high on all 3. Put together, this produces a very specific kind of person. Someone unusually perceptive, usually conscientious, unusually attuned to others, and unusually punished for it. Because those exact strengths are what keep the internal engine running long after it should have idled down. Chapter 5. The Intelligence Paradox. There's a persistent idea, especially online, that smart people overthink more because they see more angles, as if overthinking was simply a side effect of raw cognitive horsepower. The real relationship is more interesting and more specific than that. Research on intelligence and worry has found something counterintuitive. Higher verbal intelligence is associated with more worry, but higher general problem-solving intelligence is not. In other words, it's not raw IQ that predicts overthinking. It's a specific kind of intelligence, the kind built on language, on internal narration, on the ability to construct detailed, articulate stories in your head. And that makes sense because worry and rumination are mechanically made of language. Their internal monologues. A mind that is very good at generating rich, articulate internal monologues is a mind that is very good at generating rich, articulate, anxious ones. There's a second layer to this. Highly intelligent people are, on average, better than most at identifying patterns, inconsistencies, and potential problems, including in ambiguous social and professional situations. That skill is genuinely useful in a boardroom or a diagnosis. But that same pattern recognition, aimed inward at a 5-word text message from a partner, will reliably find patterns whether or not any exist, because the brain is built to find signal, and it will manufacture signal out of noise rather than return an unsatisfying "there is no pattern here." This creates a specific trap that shows up constantly in high-achieving, highly capable people. They've been rewarded their whole lives for thinking hard about problems. Thinking hard got them the good grades, the promotion, the reputation for being reliable and sharp. So when an emotional or relational problem shows up, the kind of problem that doesn't actually respond to more analysis, their default, well-practiced tool is still think about it harder. It's the only tool that has ever reliably worked for them before. It simply doesn't work on this class of problem. And because they're so good at thinking, they can convince themselves for a very long time that the next round of analysis will finally be the one that resolves it. This is the paradox in a sentence. The same cognitive machinery that makes someone excellent at solving external problems is what makes them so persuasive to themselves when misapplying that machinery to internal ones. Chapter 6. The 3 arenas where overthinking lives. Overthinking doesn't spread evenly across a person's life. It tends to concentrate in 3 specific arenas, each with its own flavor. Arena 1. Decisions. This is the overthinker standing in the cereal aisle, or staring at 2 nearly identical job offers, or rewriting the same email for the 11th time. Psychologists call the underlying pattern maximizing, the tendency to search for the objectively best possible option rather than a good enough one, which sounds admirable until you realize that in most real-world decisions, best is unknowable in advance and can only be judged with certainty in hindsight. A satisficer, by contrast, picks the first option that clears a reasonable bar and moves on. Research consistently finds that maximizers make measurably better decisions on paper and feel measurably worse about them because they never stop wondering about the option they didn't choose. Decision quality and decision satisfaction turn out to be almost entirely unrelated once you cross into maximizing territory, which is a genuinely important thing to sit with. More analysis does not reliably buy you more peace. Arena 2. Relationships. This is the replaying of conversations, the rereading of text messages, searching for hidden tone, the constructing of elaborate theories about what a friend's slightly shorter than usual reply might mean. Underneath this arena sits a single, quiet, load-bearing belief. If I can just figure out exactly what they're thinking, I'll be safe. The trouble is that other people's internal states are fundamentally unknowable from the outside with any real certainty, which means this search, unlike the search for, say, a good restaurant, literally cannot be completed. There's no data point that will ever fully satisfy it, so the mind just keeps generating more hypotheses to test against data that doesn't exist. Arena 3. The self. This is the quietest and often the most corrosive arena. The ongoing internal audit of one's own worth, competence, and likability. Did I talk too much at that dinner? Was that joke actually rude? Am I a good person? Am I behind where I should be at this age? This kind of overthinking rarely produces a decision or an action at all. There's nothing to do with the conclusion, maybe I talked too much at dinner 3 weeks ago, which means it exists purely as background noise, running for no functional reason, simply consuming attention and mood. What links all 3 arenas is the same underlying error, treating an emotional need for safety, for certainty, for belonging, as though it were a logical problem, solvable through enough analysis. It isn't. Emotional needs are addressed through action, connection, and tolerance of uncertainty, not through more thinking, but because thinking is the tool the overthinker has always trusted most. It's the tool that gets reached for again and again in exactly the situations where it's least equipped to help. Chapter 7. What it actually costs. It's worth being honest and specific about the price of chronic overthinking, because vague statements like, "it's bad for you," don't carry the same weight as seeing exactly where the damage lands. Sleep rumination and worry are two of the most well-established causes of insomnia that has no other medical explanation. The mechanism is straightforward and cruel. Lying down at night removes external distraction, which is exactly the condition under which the default mode network becomes most active. The mind that was busy all day suddenly has nothing to compete with, and the thoughts that were pushed aside during work hours rush in. Poor sleep then impairs the prefrontal cortex's regulatory function the next day, making overthinking more likely, not less. So a single bad night can seed a bad week. The body chronic worry and rumination keep the body's stress response, the sympathetic nervous system and the cortisol system, activated far more often than it's designed to be. This isn't an occasional adrenaline spike. It's a low simmer that rarely fully switches off. Over months and years, sustained cortisol elevation is linked to a long list of physical costs: suppressed immune function, elevated blood pressure, digestive problems, muscle tension, and chronic headaches, and increased risk for cardiovascular issues. The body, in other words, cannot fully tell the difference between "I am mentally rehearsing a bad conversation that might happen" and "a bad conversation is actually happening right now." It responds to imagined threat almost as strongly as it responds to real threat. Decision fatigue and paralysis. Every unresolved loop consumes a portion of a finite daily resource: attentional and decision-making bandwidth. People deep in a rumination spiral often report that unrelated decisions, what to eat, what to wear, how to respond to a simple email, start to feel disproportionately difficult. This isn't imagined. The cognitive control system, doing the work of suppressing intrusive loops, is the same system used for ordinary decision-making, and it doesn't have a separate reserve tank for each. When it's depleted by looping thoughts, everything else gets harder too. Relationships. Overthinking, especially in its relational form, tends to produce one of two opposite but equally damaging behaviors: either reassurance seeking, repeatedly asking a partner or friend, "Are we okay? Are you mad at me? Did that sound weird?" which can genuinely strain relationships over time, as the other person starts to feel like nothing they say ever fully lands. Or withdrawal, going quiet and pulling back while an internal spiral runs because it feels safer than risking saying the wrong thing while still working it out. From the outside, both behaviors look like something is wrong with the relationship. From the inside, both are actually about something happening entirely inside one person's head. Missed life. Perhaps the least discussed cost is simply presence. A person deep in rumination about last week or worry about next month is, definitionally, not fully in this week, not fully at the dinner, not fully in the conversation, not fully enjoying the achievement they just earned, because part of their attention is somewhere else, running a simulation. Over years, this adds up to something real, a felt sense, looking back, that a lot of life happened while you were somewhere else entirely. None of this is meant to be discouraging for its own sake. It's meant to make one thing clear. This pattern is not a harmless personality quirk. It has measurable costs in the body, the mind, and the relationships that matter most, which is exactly why it's worth taking seriously enough to actually interrupt, rather than just naming and accepting. Chapter 8. The hidden function. Why this pattern exists at all. If overthinking were purely destructive, evolution would likely have selected against it. It hasn't, because in the right dose, the underlying machinery is genuinely useful. And it's worth naming what overthinkers often get right, not just what they get wrong. Threat anticipation. The same vigilance that produces anxious spiraling also produces genuinely superior foresight. People who habitually run what could go wrong simulations tend to catch problems earlier in projects, in plans, in relationships than people who don't. risk managers, safety engineers, and skilled negotiators often score high on exactly the traits that, turned up too far, produce chronic worry. The trait isn't the problem. The dosage and the target are. Depth of processing rumination, specifically the version that involves genuinely trying to make sense of a difficult event rather than just replaying pain, is linked in some research to a process called post-traumatic growth, the capacity to extract meaning, insight, or changed values from a hard experience. The reflective machinery that keeps someone up at night can, when it eventually finds traction, produce real wisdom that a less reflective mind would have skipped past. Empathy and social attunement. The hypervigilance to other people's moods that fuels relational overthinking is the same sensitivity that makes someone an unusually attentive friend, partner, or colleague. Someone who notices when a coworker is having a hard week before anyone says anything, who remembers small details that matter to people, who reads a room accurately. This isn't a coincidence sitting next to the overthinking. It's the same underlying trait. Creative and analytical output. High openness, one of the strongest personality predictors of overthinking, is also one of the strongest personality predictors of creative achievement. Writers, researchers, designers, and strategists disproportionately report the kind of restless, associative, hard to switch off inner life that also produces anxious spirals when it's aimed at a worry instead of a project. Many people who eventually learn to manage their overthinking don't report losing their depth of thought. They report the same mental horsepower, becoming available for things they actually choose, instead of being conscripted by default into whatever the mind is anxious about that day. The goal, in other words, is not to become a person who thinks less. It's to become a person whose thinking has a steering wheel. Someone who can point that same capacity at a novel, a strategy, a piece of art, or a hard conversation they're actually about to have, instead of losing it every night to a conversation that already ended 3 weeks ago. Chapter 9. 3 portraits to make this concrete. Here are 3 composite portraits, not real individuals, but patterns drawn from how this shows up in real life. Portrait 1. The manager who can't send the email. Maya runs a small team. She's excellent at her job, thorough, well-liked, the person leadership trusts with anything sensitive, but she has a private ritual nobody sees. Before sending any email that isn't purely routine, she drafts it, deletes it, drafts it again, reads it in 3 different imagined tones of voice, and sometimes sits on it for a full day, running scenarios about how it might land. Colleagues experience her as calm and competent. What they don't see is that calm and competent costs her 2 extra hours a day, most of them invisible, most of them exhausting. Portrait 2. The friend who reads every message twice. James gets a text from a close friend that just says, "Hey, we should talk soon." Within 10 minutes, he has generated 4 hypotheses. She's upset with him, she's got bad news, she's pulling away, or it's nothing at all, and has started rehearsing responses to each. He won't find out which one is true for another 6 hours, and he will spend most of them somewhere between mildly and severely anxious, functioning at work while running a background process that has nothing to do with work. When they finally talk, it turns out she just wanted his opinion on a restaurant. Portrait 3. The perfectionist who can't finish Devon has been close to done with a personal project for over a year. Every time he approaches a finishing point, he notices one more flaw, one more thing that could be better, one more scenario where someone might criticize it. Each fix reveals another imperfection. From the outside, this looks like extremely high standards. From the inside, it's closer to a trap. The project can never be finished because finished was quietly redefined somewhere along the way as flawless, and flawless is not a real destination. What's notable about all 3 portraits is that none of these people look impaired from the outside. They look competent, careful, high-functioning, which is exactly why this pattern so often goes unaddressed for years. There's no visible crisis to point to, just a slow, private tax on time, sleep, and peace of mind, paid quietly every single day. Chapter 10. Breaking the loop. What actually works? This is the part most content on this topic skips or handles with vague advice like just relax or stop worrying, which is a bit like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk normally. It doesn't work because it misunderstands the mechanism. Below are approaches with real support behind them, organized by what they target. 1. Interrupting the loop in the moment. the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique, because rumination and worry live in the default mode network, the thinking about self, past, and future system. One of the fastest ways to interrupt them is to forcibly shift attention to present moment sensory input, which activates entirely different circuitry. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can physically feel, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. This sounds almost too simple to work, but it's one of the most consistently effective tools in anxiety treatment precisely because it doesn't ask the mind to stop thinking, an instruction that almost always backfires. It gives the mind something concrete to do instead. 2. Schedule worry time. This is a specific, well-studied technique from cognitive behavioral therapy. Instead of trying to suppress worry throughout the day, which paradoxically tends to make intrusive thoughts stronger, a person sets aside a specific 15 to 20-minute window each day, same time, same place, that is dedicated entirely to worrying. When a worry arises outside that window, instead of engaging with it, the person briefly notes it down and tells themselves, genuinely, I'll think about this at 6 p.m. 2 things tend to happen. Many worries lose their urgency by the time 6 p.m. arrives, and the mind, somewhat remarkably, learns to trust that the worry will get its done, which reduces its need to intrude at other times. 3. Externalizing the thought. Rumination thrives on staying internal, formless, and endlessly re-editable in the head. Writing it down, even just a few blunt sentences in a notes app, does something the mind can't do on its own. It gives the thought a fixed external shape. Once it's on the page, the mind doesn't need to keep holding it in working memory to avoid losing it. And it becomes much easier to notice, often for the first time, how repetitive or how thin the actual content is. Many people find their most punishing 2 a.m. thought looks almost laughably small once it's sitting in black and white in front of them, rather than looping unchallenged in the dark. Rather than trying to argue with an anxious thought, which keeps the thinking machinery running exactly where the problem is. Cognitive diffusion, a technique from acceptance and commitment therapy, works by changing the person's relationship to the thought instead of its content. Instead of, I'm going to get fired, the practice is to notice, I'm having the thought that I'm going to get fired. That small linguistic shift creates distance between the person and the thought. It becomes an event happening in the mind rather than a fact about the world, which makes it dramatically easier to let pass without following it all the way down. 5. Behavioral activation. Because rumination is strongly linked to depressed mood, and depressed mood strongly fuels further rumination. One of the most effective interventions is almost embarrassingly simple. Do something, especially something physical or social, particularly when the pull to sit and think it through feels strongest. This isn't distraction in the dismissive sense. It's a direct interruption of the loop that thinking cannot achieve on its own, because thinking is the loop's native fuel. A short walk, a phone call, physical movement of almost any kind reliably outperforms sitting with it for breaking an active rumination spiral. 6. The what would I tell a friend reframe. Overthinkers are consistently far harsher and far less charitable toward their own mistakes than they would ever be toward a friend's identical mistake. Explicitly asking, if my closest friend told me this exact story about themselves, what would I actually say to them? And then trying to genuinely offer yourself that same response engages self-compassion circuitry that self-criticism otherwise crowds out entirely. 7. Tolerating uncertainty on purpose. Underneath almost all chronic worry sits one core belief: uncertainty is dangerous and must be resolved before I can feel okay. This belief can be tested gently and deliberately by intentionally leaving small, low-stakes things unresolved, sending a message without rereading it 5 times, making a minor decision quickly and living with it, and noticing, concretely, that the anxiety about the ambiguity fades well before the ambiguity itself is actually resolved. This is a form of exposure therapy, and it retrains the nervous system's core assumption over repeated practice, not in a single sitting. 8. Physiological downregulation. Because chronic worry keeps the sympathetic nervous system activated, directly calming the body can loosen the mind's grip on a spiral in a way that thinking alone cannot. Slow, extended exhale breathing, for example, inhaling for 4 counts and exhaling for 6 to 8, directly activates the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic rest and digest system, measurably lowering heart rate and cortisol within minutes. This is not a metaphorical calming technique. It is a mechanical one, and it works even when a person doesn't believe it will. 9. Setting a decision deadline. For decision-related overthinking, specifically, deliberately imposing an artificial deadline. I will decide by 5 p.m. today, using only the information I already have. Short circuits the maximizer's endless search for more information, because it removes the option to keep searching. Most decisions, once actually studied, turn out to have diminishing returns on additional analysis after a surprisingly small amount of information, and forcing a deadline forces the mind to confront that directly. 10. Professional support. When rumination and worry are severe, persistent, or tied to significant anxiety or depressive symptoms, self-directed tools are a genuinely useful start, but often not sufficient on their own. Cognitive behavioral therapy, in particular, has a large and consistent evidence base for treating chronic worry and rumination specifically, and a licensed therapist can tailor these tools and others to a person's specific patterns in a way a generalist never fully can. Reaching out for that kind of support isn't a failure of the tools above. It's simply the next entirely reasonable step when a pattern has become deeply entrenched. None of these tools work by force of willpower alone, and none of them work perfectly on the first try. What they share is a common principle. They interrupt the loop from outside the loop through attention, the body, language, or behavior, rather than trying to think a way out of a problem that thinking itself is causing. Chapter 11. From overthinker to deep thinker. There's a subtle but important shift that tends to happen for people who work seriously on this pattern, and it's worth naming clearly because it reframes the entire goal of everything covered in this video. The goal was never to become a shallower person, a mind capable of noticing subtle emotional shifts, running detailed hypotheticals, and holding a problem from multiple angles at once is a genuinely valuable mind. The world benefits enormously from people who think carefully. The goal is to change where that capacity gets spent by default. Right now, for a chronic overthinker, that capacity is largely conscripted, spent without much choice in the matter, on replaying conversations that already ended and pre-living outcomes that haven't happened. The thinking is real and often genuinely sophisticated. It's just aimed, most of the time, at targets that can't actually be resolved by more thinking. The people who successfully loosen this pattern don't typically describe becoming less deep or less thoughtful. They describe something closer to reclaiming a resource that was being spent without their permission. The same reflective capacity that used to run for unsolicited hypotheses about a friend's text message becomes available instead for a project they actually care about, a genuinely difficult decision that deserves their attention, or simply being fully present for a good conversation instead of half watching it from 3 steps removed while quietly monitoring it for problems. This is why the framing of just stop overthinking has always been slightly wrong. It's not a subtraction problem, it's a redirection problem. The mind doesn't need to be quieted into silence. For most people who genuinely think a lot, that was never realistic and probably isn't even desirable. It needs a steering wheel, a set of practice skills for noticing when the machinery has been hijacked by a loop with no exit, and for gently, repeatedly, redirecting it back towards something that actually moves. That skill, like any skill, is built through repetition, not through one insight, one video, or one particularly good night's sleep. But it is buildable. The neuroplasticity research on exactly this kind of attentional retraining is genuinely encouraging. The same brain that learned years ago to scan constantly for danger can learn a new default. It took years to build the old pattern. It won't take years to meaningfully loosen it. But it will take practice, and it will take patience with yourself while you practice. If you recognized yourself somewhere in this video, in the 2 a.m. replaying, the unsent message rewritten 6 times, the decision that never quite gets made, here's what's worth carrying away from all of this. Overthinking isn't proof that something is wrong with you. It's much closer to evidence that, at some point, your mind learned this was the safest way to move through the world. Through vigilance, through anticipation, through trying to think your way to certainty in situations that don't actually offer any. That strategy may have made real sense once. It might even have been the smartest option available to you at the time. It's simply no longer serving the purpose it was built for, and it's costing more than it's giving back. The mind that won't stop turning things over isn't broken. It's a highly capable system, pointed by long habit in the wrong direction. And systems that were pointed somewhere by habit can, with real and repeated practice, be pointed somewhere else. That's genuinely the whole story. Not stop thinking, but give the thinking somewhere better to go. If this helped make sense of your own mind or someone else's, let me know in the comments and consider sharing it with the person you know who's currently rewriting a text message for the 7th time. They probably won't send it, but they might watch this. Instead, please like and subscribe.